The winter of 1983 pressed down on Eastern Europe with a silence that felt intentional, as if the land itself was holding its breath. In Moscow, lights burned through the night in offices where men no longer trusted sleep, because sleep invited dreams, and dreams invited mistakes. The balance between the superpowers had not shifted in any measurable way, yet everyone involved could feel that something was wrong. Satellites still moved in their predictable arcs. Submarines still vanished into the oceans on schedule, and diplomatic cables continued to arrive wrapped in careful language. But behind the rituals, there was a growing fear that interpretation had replaced intelligence. That expectation had begun to outweigh evidence. It was no longer enemy actions that caused panic, but enemy intentions imagined in advance. Colonel Alexei Morozov of the Soviet Strategic Analysis Directorate had spent his career studying American doctrine, memorizing patterns, learning how the other side thought it should think. He believed in systems, in logic, in the idea that even adversaries obeyed internal rules. Yet as he reviewed intercepted communications and satellite reports that morning, he saw nothing that justified the conclusions being drawn by his superiors. A NATO exercise had been elevated in status, its simulated components interpreted as concealment, its routine movements described as rehearsals for a first strike. Each report he read contained the same quiet distortion, a sentence that leaned just slightly too far toward certainty. Morozov understood then that the danger was not an incoming missile or a hidden bomber wing, but the shared belief that the other side was preparing to act because everyone expected them to. In Washington, miles away and separated by ideology rather than distance, a similar unease had taken hold. The CIA's European desk had flagged anomalies that were technically insignificant, but emotionally persuasive. Communications discipline within Soviet units had tightened. Mobile command elements had been observed relocating under the cover of weather fronts. None of it confirmed hostile intent, yet analysts spoke in the language of inevitability. The word miscalculation appeared in briefing papers so often that it lost its meaning. To younger officers, raised on simulations and war games, the escalation ladder was a familiar structure, and they assumed the Soviets saw it the same way. What they failed to consider was that fear altered perception, and perception rewrote doctrine in real time. Morozov requested permission to submit a counter-assessment, a document arguing that the signals being interpreted as preparation were in fact defensive, reflexes driven by uncertainty. The request was acknowledged and quietly buried. At that level, doubt was considered weakness, and hesitation a luxury the state could no longer afford. The leadership did not want analysis, they wanted confirmation. Every assumption reinforced the next, until the model of American aggression felt more real than the Americans themselves. Morozov began to understand that he was no longer working against an external enemy, but against an internal narrative that could not be interrupted without consequence. Across the Atlantic, a mid-level CIA officer named Daniel Reeves experienced the same isolation from the opposite side of the mirror. Reeves had spent years in Berlin watching borders that never moved, listening to sources who repeated rumors until they sounded like facts. He recognized the pattern forming now, the way uncertain data hardened into conviction as it passed through layers of authority. Reeves knew that if both sides continued to project intent onto ambiguity, the margin for error would vanish. Yet he also knew that no memo, no warning, could compete with the comfort of believing the worst. Assumptions were efficient. They required no verification, only agreement. By the end of that week, nuclear forces on both sides had reached levels of readiness unseen since the most dangerous days of the Cold War. No announcement was made, no threat issued, no ultimatum delivered. The world moved forward unaware that its survival now depended not on decisions, but on interpretations of interpretations. Somewhere between Moscow and Washington, reason was being outpaced by expectation, and the most powerful weapons ever built waited patiently for someone to be wrong. The shift to heightened readiness did not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedural caution. In underground facilities scattered across the Soviet Union, officers followed checklists they had memorized years earlier, their hands steady, their voices controlled, while an unspoken awareness settled into every room. This was no longer an exercise. It was preparation without a name. Colonel Morozov watched the transition unfold through reports that avoided direct language, each one carefully phrased to suggest prudence rather than alarm. He understood the deception was not aimed at the enemy, but at themselves. By refusing to acknowledge escalation, they avoided confronting how close they were moving toward an irreversible threshold. Morozov began to notice subtle changes in behavior among his colleagues. Conversations shortened, jokes disappeared. No one challenged conclusions anymore, because challenging them meant introducing uncertainty, and uncertainty had become synonymous with vulnerability. In briefing rooms, maps were studied not for what they showed, but for what they might conceal. Every gap became suspicious. Every delay was interpreted as intent. Morozov realized that the analytical framework he had trusted, his entire career had inverted itself. Evidence no longer shaped assumptions. Assumptions reshaped evidence. The system was feeding on its own expectations, growing more confident as it became less connected to reality. In Washington, Daniel Reeves found himself trapped in a similar loop, though the language was different. Briefings emphasized worst-case interpretations, not because they were proven, but because they were safer politically. No one wanted to be responsible for underestimating the adversary. The memory of past intelligence failures lingered in every room, turning caution into overcompensation. Reeves listened as senior analysts spoke about Soviet movements as if they were lines in a script already written. When he raised the possibility that the observed actions were responses rather than initiatives, the room grew uncomfortable. His point was noted and set aside, absorbed without impact. The most dangerous element was time. Decisions were being made faster than understanding could keep up. Automated systems reduced reaction windows, compressing human judgment into seconds. Reeves studied reports on early warning protocols and felt a quiet dread at how much depended on interpretation in those first moments after an alert. False positives were not hypothetical. They were documented. Yet the confidence in technology had grown to the point where doubt was treated as an obstacle. The machines were trusted because humans were afraid of their own hesitation. Back in Moscow, Morozov received an internal summary indicating that American command elements had increased communication redundancy. The assessment framed it as preparation for sustained operations under attack. Morozov saw it differently. To him, it looked like fear, like an organization bracing itself for the possibility that something might go wrong. He drafted a private note to himself, acknowledging a thought he could not safely share. If both sides were acting defensively, but interpreting defense as offense, then escalation was no longer driven by intent, but by reflection. Each side was reacting to a mirror image of its own anxiety. As days passed, the atmosphere thickened. Weather reports were scrutinized for patterns that might hide movement. Training accidents were whispered about as cover stories. Intelligence became less about gathering facts and more about reinforcing belief. Reeves and Morozov, unknown to each other and separated by ideology, stood on opposite ends of the same narrowing corridor. Both understood that the systems surrounding them were no longer designed to slow conflict down, but to justify its acceleration. And neither could see a way to stop it without being crushed by the very assumptions that claimed to protect them. The first real fracture appeared not as an explosion or a provocation, but as a silence where a signal should have been. In the early hours of a gray morning, one of the Soviet early warning satellites failed to transmit its scheduled data burst. The technical explanation was mundane, a software fault compounded by solar interference. But in an environment shaped by expectation, the absence of information carried more weight than its presence. Operators logged the anomaly, escalated it according to procedure, and watched as a small irregularity began its slow transformation into something ominous. Colonel Morozov was called in before dawn, standing beneath fluorescent lights as technicians spoke in carefully neutral tones, each aware that their words might be used to justify decisions far beyond their control. Morozov listened and felt a familiar tension tighten in his chest. He knew how fragile these systems were, how often minor failures occurred and were quietly corrected. Yet he also understood that context mattered more than probability. In a climate of distrust, coincidence became intention. A missing signal suggested concealment. Concealment suggested preparation. Preparation implied imminent action. The chain of reasoning required no proof, only momentum. Morozov argued for patience, for cross-verification, for waiting on secondary systems. But patience had become suspect. Waiting was now perceived as risk. The logic was merciless in its simplicity. If the enemy was about to strike, hesitation would be fatal. If they were not, readiness cost nothing. That belief alone pushed the system closer to the edge. In the United States, a parallel disturbance rippled through intelligence channels. An unexpected surge in encrypted Soviet communications was detected across several regions, a predictable response to internal alerts, but one that matched perfectly with American assumptions of pre-launch coordination. Daniel Reeves read the summary and felt the same hollow certainty he had learned to distrust. He recognized the pattern of analytical compression, where complex realities were flattened into narratives that decision makers could grasp quickly. Context was stripped away in favor of clarity. The message became simple and therefore dangerous. Something is happening. Something is coming. Reeves requested access to raw intercepts, looking for nuance buried beneath classification layers. What he found did not reassure him. The data was chaotic, fragmented and inconclusive, but that very ambiguity allowed it to be molded into whatever shape was required. He prepared an internal assessment, suggesting that the activity reflected internal uncertainty rather than coordinated aggression. The response was polite and dismissive. His supervisors thanked him for his diligence and reminded him that uncertainty was precisely what made the situation unstable. They were no longer asking whether the Soviets intended to act. They were asking how soon. In Moscow, Morozov watched as the anomaly escalated into a formal alert status. Additional forces were placed on standby. Command chains shortened. Authority consolidated upward. Each step was justified as a precaution, yet each one reduced the space for correction. Morozov realized that even if the satellite failure was resolved, the psychological shift it had triggered could not be undone. The system had crossed an invisible line, where returning to normal felt more dangerous than continuing forward. Fear had rewritten the baseline. That night, both men lay awake, separated by thousands of kilometers, but bound by the same realization. The machinery of deterrence they had been taught to trust was now operating on distorted inputs. It was no longer a balance of power, but a balance of expectations. And expectations were proving far more volatile. The enemy was no longer a nation or an ideology, but a story both sides were telling themselves. A story that demanded an ending, whether it was true or not. The moment of maximum tension arrived without ceremony. There was no single alarm, no dramatic declaration, only a gradual narrowing of options that felt almost procedural. In Soviet command centers, status boards changed color, and with each change, the room grew quieter. Colonel Morozov stood behind a row of officers as confirmation codes were distributed and verified, the process unfolding with an efficiency that left no room for reflection. He understood that the system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It was responding to perceived threat with speed and certainty. What it could not do was question the foundation of that perception. Morozov was granted a brief window to present a final assessment. He spoke carefully, choosing words that emphasized risk without assigning blame. He described how feedback loops between intelligence, interpretation, and operational readiness could create the illusion of inevitability. He warned that mirrored escalation might lead both sides to interpret restraint as deception. His arguments were received with expressions of concern and followed by silence. The decision-makers did not disagree with him. They simply no longer believed that doubt could protect them. In a world defined by worst-case thinking, acting on incomplete information felt safer than waiting for clarity that might never arrive. In Washington, Daniel Reeves watched the same dynamic unfold through secure video, feeds and briefing summaries. Strategic forces had been repositioned in ways that were technically defensive but visually unmistakable. Advisors spoke of signaling resolve, of demonstrating readiness to prevent miscalculation. Reeves recognized the paradox immediately. Each signal intended to reassure instead reinforced the other side's fears. The language of deterrence had become self-referential, divorced from the realities it was meant to manage. Reeves drafted a note warning that signaling without shared understanding was indistinguishable from provocation. It was read, acknowledged, and overridden by the momentum of events. As hours passed, automated systems assumed greater authority. Human oversight narrowed to confirmation rather than deliberation. In both capitals, the logic was the same. If an alert appeared, it would have to be treated as real, because the cost of being wrong was unthinkable. That logic left no room for false alarms, even though history had proven they were inevitable. Morozov watched technicians feed data into models that produced increasingly confident predictions based on increasingly uncertain inputs. He felt a sense of detachment, as if observing a natural disaster that could no longer be influenced. Late in the night, a preliminary alert flashed across a Soviet console, indicating a possible launch detected beyond the horizon. The signal was weak, ambiguous, and inconsistent with known trajectories, but it existed, and that was enough. Procedures advanced to the next stage. Morozov felt time compress into a narrow corridor where minutes lost their meaning. He knew that if the alert was treated as genuine, the chain of response would move faster than any individual could intervene. Across the ocean, Reeves would later learn that a similar alert had been flagged and dismissed within American systems, not because it was clearly false, but because it did not align with expectations formed only hours earlier. In that asymmetry lay the final danger. Each side believed it understood the other's mindset, yet both were operating on outdated assumptions. The margin between survival and catastrophe now rested on interpretation measured in seconds. Morozov stood in the command center as the alert was reviewed for confirmation, aware that the fate of millions depended not on hostile intent, but on whether a flawed system would be given the benefit of the doubt. The alert did not mature into certainty. That single fact, small and almost anticlimactic, became the dividing line between history as it was lived and history as it might have ended. Additional data arrived slowly, unevenly stripping confidence from the initial detection until it could no longer support the weight placed upon it. The suspected launch dissolved into background noise, a convergence of atmospheric distortion and sensor misalignment that, under different circumstances, would never have escaped notice. In the command center, the change was subtle but profound. Voices returned. Breathing became audible. The system, having surged forward on assumption, now retreated on verification, though no one spoke of relief. Colonel Morozov remained standing long after the alert was formally downgraded. He understood that what had just occurred would never be fully recorded. Official reports would describe proper procedure, disciplined response, and the successful functioning of safeguards. There would be no mention of how close interpretation had come to becoming action. Morozov felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The crisis had not been caused by strategy or ideology, but by a collective surrender to expectation. The enemy had been imagined so vividly that reality had nearly been overwritten. In Washington, Daniel Reeves read the post-event summaries with the same quiet disbelief. The language was confident, controlled, and carefully constructed to imply mastery. Yet Reeves knew how fragile that mastery had been. He knew that a different configuration of assumptions, a slightly altered sequence of alerts, could have produced an entirely different outcome. The systems designed to prevent war had functioned, but only barely, and not for the reasons their designers had intended. Deterrence had not held because of balance, but because of coincidence. In the days that followed, readiness levels gradually decreased, though the underlying distrust remained untouched. Publicly, nothing had happened. Privately, a small number of individuals carried the knowledge that the world had come close to ending not through hatred or ambition, but through imagination unchecked by restraint. Morozov returned to his office, surrounded by files that now felt less like tools and more like liabilities. He began drafting a classified reflection, knowing it would likely be archived and forgotten, but unable to remain silent. Reeves, thousands of kilometers away, made a similar choice. He wrote an internal memorandum arguing that intelligence failures were no longer defined by missing information, but by excessive certainty. He warned that as long as assumptions were rewarded and doubt was punished, future crises would escalate faster and end less quietly. He did not expect his warning to change policy. He wrote it because history, when finally revealed, deserved at least one honest account. Years later, when fragments of that period were declassified, analysts would debate doctrines and decision trees, searching for lessons in charts and timelines. Few would acknowledge the simplest truth. The most dangerous weapon of that era had not been nuclear, warheads or delivery systems, but the human need to believe that one understood the enemy. On that winter night, the world survived not because its guardians were wise, but because assumption, for once, failed to find confirmation.